Hi everyone and welcome on board your really long-haul flight. On this channel we've put together a compilation of some of the most jaw-dropping moments from the sky. So now all that you need to do is find a comfortable place to sit, bring out your favorite drink, sit back and relax. A Boeing 767 is climbing out over the dense jungles of northern Thailand. The pilots are settling into their seats for the long flight ahead when suddenly a warning related to the aircraft's thrust reverser system appears. This is the start of a terrifying chain of events that the aircraft manufacturer didn't even think was possible. Stay tuned. On the 26th of May 1991, a crew from Lauda Air was getting ready for a two-leg flight, bringing them from Kai Tak Airport in Hong Kong towards Bangkok in Thailand and then finally towards their home base in Vienna, Austria. This was part of a 3 times weekly service that Lauda Air was doing between Bangkok and Vienna, and the aircraft that was being flown was a Boeing 767-300 that had been purchased new to Lauda Air only about 2.5 years earlier in October 1989. This aircraft was a long-range version of the Boeing 767 and it was equipped with 2 Pratt & Whitney 4060 high-bypass turbofan engines. These engines were state-of-the-art, they were very efficient, but the way that they were constructed is going to have a major impact on what's about to happen, so we're going to have to become a little bit technical now. A high-bypass turbofan engine is basically an engine where the majority of the thrust that is pushing the aircraft forward is produced by the big fan in front of the engine, rather than the air that passes through the core and the burn chambers. In the case of the Pratt & Whitney 4060 engines, the bypass ratio was about 5:1, meaning that there was 5 times as much volume of air that passed the bypass duct of the engine than what passed through the core of the engine. This high bypass ratio meant a lot better fuel economy and also much lower noise on these new engines, because it turns out that using the fan to move a larger volume of air at a slower speed is much more efficient than trying to accelerate a smaller volume of air into higher speed. This is, by the way, why all modern engines seems to be getting bigger and bigger, but that's a slightly different story. Another consequence of this shift in design was that the engine's thrust reversers could now be constructed differently. On older type of jet engines, the reverse thrust was constructed by 2 buckets being extended and then deployed into the core airflow, basically redirecting the whole core airflow into a forward angle. But with these new high bypass engines, it was found that it was much more efficient to use 2 translating sleeves that would move back, and they would then extend blocker doors into the bypass duct. That would redirect the bypass flow forward through some fixed cascade vanes, and that would create the reverse thrust. However, another consequence of this was that the reverse thrust was now being created in a slightly different place. While in the old engines, the reverse thrust was being created at the very back of the engines, now the reverse thrust was being created much further ahead, and that is going to have an impact on what's about to happen. But why is reverse thrust so important? Well, as the aircraft kept becoming bigger and heavier and started to be able to fly during all sorts of different types of weather, it became very apparent for the industry that the aircraft needed more than one way to decelerate after landing or during a rejected takeoff. The thrust reversers created a different type of braking than what the wheel brakes would, and it turned out that especially during operations on wet or slippery runways, the reversers were extremely important. And even if they operated the aircraft on dry runways, the reversers helped to take some energy away from the brakes, which meant that the temperature of the brake discs could be lowered substantially. Now, the reversers on commercial aircraft were only certified to operate on the ground, and because of that, the aircraft manufacturers had built in several redundant systems to make sure that they couldn't be deployed once the aircraft was airborne. On the Boeing 767, this was accomplished via a safety mechanism that connected the weight on wheel switches of the aircraft. Those are switches that can feel if the aircraft is on the ground or if it's airborne, was connected to two electrically activated hydraulic valves that both independently could make sure that the thrust reversers remained closed whilst the aircraft was airborne. The first valve was called a hydraulic isolation valve, the HIV, and it received signals from the weight on wheel switches, and when the weight on wheel switches indicated that the aircraft was airborne, the hydraulic isolation valve just cut access from hydraulic fluid into the thrust reverser mechanism. And this was true any time that the aircraft was airborne, except when a system called the restow circuit was active, but we'll get to that later on. If for whatever reason the hydraulic isolation valve would malfunction during flight and allow hydraulic fluid into the thrust reversers, that would send a warning to the pilot called reverser isolation, notifying them that this was going on. Remember that. Now, following the hydraulic isolation valve was a second valve called the directional control valve, the DCV. The directional control valve then directed hydraulic fluid to either deploy or close the thrust reversers, and the directional control valve was defaulted into the closed position. So together, these two valves were built in a way that should ensure redundancy to keep the thrust reversers closed whenever the aircraft was airborne. On top of this, the engines were constructed to automatically reduce the thrust on the engine back to idle in case it felt that any of the thrust reverser sleeves was starting to move. But of course, no system is completely foolproof, and that had been proven by a couple of uncommanded thrust reverser deployment in flight on some other aircraft types, including the DC-8, the DC-10, the Boeing 707 and the Boeing 747. And because that had happened, the FAA had mandated Boeing to, before certification, prove either through flight tests or in-flight modeling that the aircraft would be able to be handled properly in case a thrust reverser would deploy in flight. Those tests and models were built based on a couple of assumptions, namely that this thrust reverser deployment would happen to an aircraft which was at a relatively low both altitude and airspeed. And the reason it was made like that was because that was seen as the most critical scenario. Because if the airspeed is low, it means that the effect of the flight control surfaces would also be lower. That would be detrimental when it came to handling the effects of the asymmetric thrusts that the thrust reverser deployment would cause, and also the loss of lift on the wing that had happened. The test and models also assumed that the engine would be back at idle thrust before the thrust reverser deployment event would happen, and that was because of the way that the engines had been designed, that the thrust reverser sleeves shouldn't be able to start moving unless the engines were first back at idle. With all of these assumptions met, the model showed that the wing that was associated with the deployed thrust reverser would only lose about 10% of its lift due to the air that was now being forced forward by the thrust reverser, disrupting the airflow at the leading edge of the wing. This would cause a moderate roll, and together with a yaw that was induced by the asymmetric thrust, this would only lead to moderate problems with controlling the aircraft, something that was well within the capabilities of a trained pilot. On the 26th of May, the day started just like any other day for the crew. The pilots met up in the crew room in Hong Kong and started going through the flight plan, the NOTAMs, the weather, and all of the other briefing material. And once they were done with that, they talked to the cabin crew, and then together they went out to the aircraft. When they came into the aircraft, the captain went through the technical log, and the technical status of the aircraft was perfectly fine. It was perfectly airworthy. Now, if the captain would have looked back through the technical history of the aircraft, he would have noticed that there had been some work carried out on this aircraft by the technical department. Specifically, there had been several instances of fault messages being sent from the left-hand thrust reverser. These were minor fault messages, but the maintenance department in Lauda had been troubleshooting this on and off for the last 6 months or so. They had followed the fault isolation manual that Boeing had provided to them, and that had led them to replace some of the components inside of the thrust reverser. That would work for a little while, but after a few flights, similar fault messages would start reappearing again. Now, because these faults were indicated as minor and not critical, the dispatch deviation procedure guide actually allowed the aircraft to be dispatched and to fly with these fault codes for up to a maximum of 500 hours before it had to be rectified. And every time that they did something that rectified the fault, these 500 hours would be reset. So this was why the aircraft had been flying with these reoccurring fault messages for the last 6 months. The technical engineering department was not happy with this though, so they had started to inspect all of the electrical wire bundles that was going out to the left-hand thrust reverser to see if maybe there was something in there that was causing these fault messages to appear. But since this was not a mandatory inspection and not part of the normal maintenance schedule, they did this on and off, and meanwhile the aircraft kept flying. So even if the captain would have gone back through the tech log and seen that this maintenance work had been carried out and was going on, it is unlikely that he would have reacted to it, because according to the tech log it was fully airworthy with no limitations whatsoever. The captain of the flight was a 48-year-old American citizen with about 11,750 hours of total flight experience. He was assisted by a 41-year-old first officer with just over 6,500 hours, and together with them were 8 cabin crew members on this flight. On the first flight from Hong Kong over towards Bangkok, the first officer was pilot flying. They taxied out in Kai Tak, took off completely normally, and proceeded to fly over to Bangkok without any indication of any type of problems. They landed on time according to schedule, taxied into their stand where they proceeded to do a normal turnaround, uploading more fuel, passengers and cargo, getting ready for their flight back towards Vienna. On the second flight of the day, the captain was going to be pilot flying. The pre-flight setup, the walk around and all the general preparation was completely normal, and at time 16:02, that's 23:02 local time, the aircraft received its pushback clearance and pushed back from the gate to start to taxi out for departure on runway 21 left in Bangkok. On board the aircraft was 213 passengers, 8 cabin crew members and 2 pilots. And at time 23:15, Lauda Air Flight 004 started rolling down runway 21 left for takeoff. The takeoff was completely normal. They started climbing initially to 7,000 feet and turned towards the northwest. The weather in the area was quite good. It was a little bit cloudy, temperature of 26 degrees with some light winds and some forecast of thunderstorms in the general area, but nothing indicated that any thunderstorms were close to the flight path of Flight 004. After takeoff, the first officer contacted the Bangkok departures ATC frequency. The flight was then cleared to continue to climb to 11,000 feet and turn towards a waypoint called Limbo. This was read back by the first officer, who was then told to contact the next departure controller. The new controller told the flight to continue climb to flight level 310, that's 31,000 feet, and continue on the flight plan route. The flaps were retracted as per normal procedures, and once the flaps were up, the first officer completed the after takeoff checklist, and he then started to complete the flight plan, to fill in the actual departure time, to calculate the times over each waypoint and the fuel they could expect at each waypoint. And then once he was done with this, he passed on those figures on to the ground controller, the operations controller in Bangkok for Lauda Air, so that they could follow the progress of the flight. About 4 minutes and 45 seconds into the flight, the first officer suddenly exclaims, "Shit, that keeps coming on," referring to a left reverser isolation warning. Now, the way he says it indicates that this warning must have been coming on and going out a couple of times before he actually says something about it. Now, do you remember what the reverser isolation warning actually means? Exactly. This means that the hydraulic isolation valve that keeps the hydraulic fluid away from the thrust reverser mechanism is now open in flight. The captain acknowledges this and tells the first officer to please take out the quick reference handbook non-normal checklist for this specific failure. The first officer does so, he finds the checklist, but when he starts reading the checklist, it doesn't really have any action items. It gives a little bit of information about the fault, and then it says that additional failures might cause in-flight thrust reverser deployment. It also says that the pilot can expect normal operation of the thrust reverser after landing. This likely reassures the pilots, because anytime that a QRA checklist doesn't have any action items in it and doesn't tell the pilots to land at the closest suitable airport, it basically means that the failure is not that critical. And the fact that the checklist just casually refers to any additional failures might cause an in-flight deployment of the thrust reverser, that just says that because, remember, there's still the directional control valve that is supposed to keep the thrust reversers closed. And the in-flight testing that has been done prior to the certification of the aircraft has shown that even if the thrust reversers does deploy, it should be okay, easily handled by the pilots. Now, there is an additional checklist for an actual in-flight deployment of the thrust reverser, and that checklist basically just tells the pilots to shut the associated engine down to minimize the effect of the reverser. The pilots now keep discussing this indication as they're climbing away further, and the first officer suggests that maybe they should contact the handling frequency in Bangkok to tell the engineering department that they have this problem and see if they have any guidance for them. The captain says that, yeah, that's a great idea, contact them, but tell them that it's likely moisture or something, because the indication keeps coming on and off all the time. Now, I understand why the captain thought this, because a lot of warnings in an aircraft is triggered by microswitches. These microswitches are monitoring the position of certain components, and sometimes moisture or contamination can get into these microswitches and make them give faulty warnings. Actual faults tends to be more permanent in nature, so when you have a small warning like this going on and off, blinking like that, given the amount of information that the captain knows at this point, I would probably have thought the same. In any case, the aircraft continues to climb up towards 31,000 feet that they've been cleared, and a few seconds later the first officer remarks to the captain that it looks like he needs a little bit of left trim. What the first officer likely means is that he can see that the steering wheel is slightly displaced towards the left. This can happen when there is some unexpected drag on one side of the aircraft, in this case on the right-hand side, that causes a little bit of a yaw, and the autopilot responds to this by putting aileron in against that side to make sure that the aircraft keeps flying straight ahead. But obviously flying with ailerons like that is not the most economical thing to do. So what we do is that we have a little rudder on the back side of the main rudder that you can displace in order to counteract that yaw. That will then center the steering wheel, and the aircraft will continue to fly straight ahead, but in a more clean configuration. Now, this remark is unlikely to have anything to do with what's about to happen next. About 4.5 minutes after the first officer made the comment about the trim, this is 15 minutes and 1 second into the flight, the first officer suddenly exclaims, "Oh, the thrust reverser is deployed." At this point, the aircraft is at an altitude of 24,700 feet, climbing with a speed of Mach 0.78 and with the engines producing full climb thrusts. The next thing that can be heard on the voice recorder is sound similar to the aircraft shuddering and a metallic snap. The aircraft now enters into a rapid roll to the left, accompanied by a violent pitch down, and within seconds several warnings can be heard on the cockpit voice recorder, including the altitude alert and several master caution warnings. A second metallic snap can then be heard, followed by the captain exclaiming, "Jesus Christ!" followed 12 seconds later by the captain saying, "Here, wait a moment," and then 5 seconds after that, "Damn it!" Evidence indicates that it took the pilots approximately 10 seconds to shut the left engine down, but at that point it was already too late. As this is all happening, you can hear on the cockpit voice recorder how the background noise is steadily increasing, indicating a higher and higher indicated airspeed. This is then later accompanied by a continuous overspeed warning. But why is this happening? The aircraft is supposed to be controllable even if one of the thrust reversers are deployed. Well, it turns out that when the modeling was done, it was based both on a much lower airspeed, about 200 knots, and this aircraft is actually making Mach 0.78, and it also assumed that the engine would have been spooled back to idle before the reverse thrust was activated. In this case, whatever failure that caused the thrust reverser sleeves to start moving backward did so while the engines were still producing climb thrust. And remember how we were talking about these new reversers? They produced thrust a little bit further forward on the engines. Well, this meant that as these thrust reverser sleeves were now moving backwards, they produced an enormous plume of reverse air that came out just in front of the leading edges of the wings, likely reducing the lift available on that wing with as much as 25%, not the 10% that the models had shown. This sudden and violent onset of reverse thrust on the left-hand side initiated a 28 degrees per second roll towards the left, together with a violent yaw due to the asymmetric thrust situation. The pilots would have had to immediately initiate full right rudder and full right aileron to try to counteract this, together with reducing the thrust on the operating right engine to minimize the thrust asymmetry. But here, the pilots would have faced their next hurdle, which is that as this descent initiated, they were already at a speed of Mach 0.78. And as the speed now continued to increase, as we could hear from the cockpit voice recorder and the overspeed warning, it meant that the pressures and the stresses on the aircraft would have built up enormously. And that would have meant that the pilots would have had to be very, very careful in order to not overstress the aircraft structure as they tried to both maneuver out of the situation and pull the aircraft out of the dive. Simultaneously, as the aircraft is now accelerating and getting closer to the speed of sound, the effect of the flight controls would start to become less effective due to elasticity and aerodynamic Mach effects. And if you put that together with the fact that they're still suffering from asymmetric thrust from the now deployed thrust reverser, it together means that this situation became completely uncontrollable within seconds after the thrust reverser deployed. What now follows is a terrifying example of what happens to an aircraft when it exceeds its maximum both speed and maneuvering loads. We don't know exactly how high the speed became in the end, but we do know from the EEC memory on the left-hand side that it recorded Mach 0.99 as its highest value, and that was likely the highest value that it could record. In reality, it is a possibility that this aircraft exceeded Mach 1 during its descent down towards the ground. The first parts that separated the aircraft were sections of the rudder and the left elevator, probably due to buffeting overload. This was then followed by a large section of the right horizontal stabilizer that was ripped off the aircraft as the pilots tried to pull it out of the dive. The fact that most of the right stabilizer was now gone and not on the left-hand side started creating asymmetrical forces on the back of the aircraft, basically acting like a giant hand turning a corkscrew. This damaged both the skin and the connecting structure in the tail, leading to the separation of what was left of the horizontal stabilizer and the tail fin. Without the stabilizing downforce from the stabilizer, the aircraft now turned into an almost vertical dive, increasing the speed even further. This led to the stresses on the wings just becoming too great, which meant that the wings now broke off, and as that happened, that ignited the fuel inside of the fuel tanks, leading to an enormous fireball that could be seen by eyewitnesses on the ground. On the cockpit voice recorder, the complete breakup of the aircraft could be heard as a series of bangs and metallic snaps about 26 seconds after the initial indication of the thrust reverser deployment. This was calculated to have happened at approximately 4,000 feet, and about 3 seconds later the aircraft impacted the ground. There were no survivors of this accident, making this the first deadly accident of a Boeing 767 and the worst aviation disaster in Thailand to this day. Unfortunately, the post-impact fire also completely destroyed the flight data recorder, making it impossible to find out for sure what parts of the system caused the in-flight thrust reverser deployment. The crash site was also looted before the investigation team could get there, and one of the things that the looters took with them was the hydraulic directional control valve from the left-hand engine, which was a crucial piece of evidence. The valve was eventually returned to the investigation team about 9 months after the accident, but there were indications that it had been tampered with when it was returned. So now the investigation team had to try to figure out what had happened, and they didn't have the flight data recorder in order to help them. So they started looking back through any kind of similar fault that had happened on the Boeing 767 fleet, and they quickly found that there were some wiring issues leading up to the thrust reverser system that could potentially leave the hydraulic isolation valve to open up in flight, causing the kind of indications that the pilots had reported during this flight. Now, if that fault existed and it was combined with another short circuit within the electrical system, that could potentially lead to the directional control valve activating a thrust reverser deployment in flight. The investigation team also found that if the hydraulic isolation valve was open for whatever reason and there was some contaminations or blockage inside of the directional control valve, that blockage could also lead to an activation of the thrust reverser. As soon as the investigation revealed this, Boeing issued a technical service bulletin that mandated several upgrades to the Boeing 767s that were fitted with Pratt & Whitney 4000 model engines. The first thing that was mandated was that all thrust reversers was deactivated until the upgrades could be implemented, and the upgrades included things like a dedicated restore circuit, much better and individual electrical wiring, and a few other things as well that after the upgrade made a thrust reverser deployment in flight virtually impossible. But it was still the issue with why this aircraft couldn't be controlled. It had been certified, the pilots should have been able to handle it. Lauda Air spent a lot of resources on this, and Niki Lauda himself was deeply involved in the investigation work. Among other things, they tried to replicate the flight in a flight simulator, and when they did that, it showed that this event should have been controllable. But it turned out that the simulators just did not have the correct performance parameters to accurately simulate the handling characteristics in this incident. And when Boeing heard about this, they initiated wind tunnel testing with a model very similar to a Boeing 767 in low-speed wind tunnels, and then they extrapolated to see what would happen in higher speed scenarios. And when they got the data from that, they put that into one of their own simulators, and they had the Boeing chief technical pilot actually try to fly it. And he very quickly realized that unless the pilots did everything right within 4 to a maximum of 6 seconds after an in-flight deployment with this kind of situation, it would have been impossible for the pilots to recover. So Boeing basically conceded that an untrained flight crew that was given this type of situation would not be expected to be able to handle it. This accident really opened the eyes of the industry into the possibilities and the risks associated with an in-flight thrust reverser deployment event. It spurred a lot of innovation into system design improvements and redundancies to keep this thing from happening. The investigation recommended revisions in how the FAA certified aircraft with thrust reversers to make sure that they couldn't deploy in flight, and also improvements on how the cockpit voice recorder and the flight data recorder could be further insulated and kept away from damage in case of a post-accident fire. Two aircraft, two sets of crews and passengers who are all traveling somewhere for a purpose. Maybe they have plans to visit relatives or going on a work trip, or maybe this is just a regular day on the job. No matter what the circumstances are, these passengers and crew will all be soon forced to share something truly terrible. Stay tuned. The 1st of February 1991 was a nice crisp day in California, United States. The visibility was good with only some few high clouds, and the air traffic coming into Los Angeles International Airport was flowing smoothly. As the afternoon went on, the air traffic controllers in the tower went about their duties like on any other day, and nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Los Angeles Airport, or LAX as I will refer to it here, was already back then a sprawling, huge airport with 4 active runways. Now, at LAX, the controllers operated a bit differently than in other US airports, in that all of its runways could be used simultaneously for both takeoff and landing, whilst the other airports normally assigned some runways for takeoff and others exclusively for landings. The fact that LAX didn't do that meant that the workload in the tower could at times be quite high, but this afternoon it was relatively calm with only a quite moderate flow. On that same day, a Fairchild Metroliner from SkyWest Airlines was scheduled to operate several short flights within California. Eventually, there was a crew change at Inyokian Airport, where the 2 new pilots took over the aircraft and then initially flew it over to Los Angeles. They then continued operating to Fresno and then back to Los Angeles again, where they, around 17:30 local time, were finally getting ready for a flight over to Palmdale. This Metroliner had seats for up to 19 passengers, and since it was operating under FAR Part 23 commuter regulations, it was allowed to operate with only 2 pilots and no cabin crew. So on this leg over to Palmdale, there were 10 passengers and 2 pilots on board, and they were using call sign SkyWest 5569. The Metroliner was a great little aircraft, powered by 2 turboprop engines on a low-mounted wing, and even though it had a pretty tall landing gear, the whole aircraft was still pretty low, especially compared to a Boeing 737, and that will become important later on in this story. The other thing that is worth mentioning here was its external lighting. It consisted of a standard green and red navigation light on each wing, together with white flashing strobe lights on the wings and tail, a white nav light also on the tail, and a red anti-collision light mounted on the top of the tail fin. This anti-collision light had a brightness of 100 candles, or 1257 lumen, which was about 4 times weaker than the current standard was back in 1991, but since this aircraft had been certified back in the early 1970s, it was still approved. Another peculiarity with this anti-collision light was that it was partly obscured by the rudder cap, meaning that it was hard to see at angles of around 5.4 degrees above and behind it. Now, on top of all of those lights that I just mentioned, there were also forward-facing landing lights, taxi lights, as well as a couple of ice-detecting lights that was illuminating the wings. All of this aircraft lighting basically had 2 primary purposes. The first was just like headlights on a car to illuminate where the aircraft was going when it was taxiing, landing and taking off, and the other, more important purpose was to make sure that the aircraft was visible to other aircraft as well as to air traffic control. But this was primarily something that was thought of as being important when the aircraft was airborne. On the ground, only certain parts of this lighting, like the taxi light, nav lights and anti-collision light, was normally used in order to not blind other traffic around. Whilst the SkyWest pilots were working on helping their passengers to board, another aircraft, a Boeing 737-300 from USAIR, was already airborne and inbound towards Los Angeles. It had started the day in Syracuse and was heading to its final destination in San Francisco, with intermediate stops in Washington, D.C., Columbus, Ohio and Los Angeles. There had been a scheduled crew change in Washington, where the current pilots had taken over, and since the captain had flown the first leg to Columbus, the first officer was now pilot flying on flight 1493, and they had 83 passengers on board. The day had been running really smoothly so far, and the 2 pilots were in a great mood as they continued their roughly 4 hours and 40-minute flight at a cruise altitude of 35,000 feet. The captain was 48 years old and was very experienced, with a total time of 16,300 hours, of which 4,300 had been flown on the Boeing 737. He had upgraded to the captain position about 6 years before this flight and was very comfortable in his role. The first officer was 32 years old and had just over 4,300 hours of total time, 982 of which had been flown on the 737. He had previously been flying on Learjet before getting hired by USAIR just over 2 years prior. The pilots were joined by 4 cabin crew members, and one of them had, during the boarding, stopped at the overwing exit and asked the passenger, that she saw was very young, whether he would be able to fulfill the duties of an able-bodied person in case of an evacuation. Now, an able-bodied person is someone who will be able to assist the cabin crew with things like opening emergency exits, potentially helping other passengers in case it would be needed in an emergency. And only people who are able to do so can be seated next to emergency exits. In this case, the passenger responded that he was 17 years old and thought that he would be able to do it. Now, when she heard this, the cabin crew agreed, but still decided to brief him and the other passengers about how to operate the emergency exit, something that wasn't standard actually back then. Keep that in mind. Now, most of you are probably quite familiar with the Boeing 737 already, but for those of you who aren't, the 737-300 is a twin-engine jet aircraft with a passenger capacity, in the case of USAIR, of 128. And from a technical standpoint, this was a very modern aircraft at the time, and this particular individual was 6 years old, with largely original interior panels and furnishings. There were no technical defects recorded on it, but one thing that's worth pointing out here is that in 1985, new rules concerning the fire retardant properties of furnishings in aircraft had been implemented. These new rules required that the materials used in new aircraft had to be very flame retardant, but this aircraft was manufactured just before these rules came into place. Now, it did have a partial refurbishing in 1989, but most of the overhead bins and the interior walls were still made from the original materials. Another technical aspect of the 737 is where it's storing its flight crew oxygen cylinder. You see, in case of a rapid depressurization at high altitude, the passengers would be fed oxygen from masks which drops down from the overhead bins. I'm sure you've seen that. These masks are connected to oxygen generators who, through the combination of chemicals, will produce oxygen for around 13 minutes or so. This is generally well enough to allow the pilots to perform an emergency descent down to 10,000 feet where the air is then fully breathable again. But the pilots does not get their oxygen from an oxygen generator. Instead, their masks are fed from an oxygen cylinder which is located under the cockpit just forward of the front cargo hold, and this oxygen cylinder will soon play an important part. Anyway, around time 1740, the crew of USAIR Flight 1493 received their first descent clearance down towards LAX, and the area controller told them that they were cleared for the Civet 2 arrival and descent profile. The captain read this back, and the first officer initiated the descent, whilst also verifying that this was the arrival route that they had already briefed and prepared for. The sun had just set beneath the ocean in the west, and it must have been a beautiful sight as the pilots were now descending into the darkness below them. The aircraft was cleared to descend in steps down towards Los Angeles, and they were also told that they could expect runway 24 right or left for landing, but that they would be advised later on which one of those runways it would actually be. The pilots continued following normal procedures, including advising the cabin crew when they were about 15 minutes away from the airport, and that prompted the cabin crew to secure the cabin. Everything was working just like clockwork. At time 17:57 and 28 seconds, the LAX Terminal Radar Approach Controller, TRACON, instructed Flight 1493 to intercept the localizer for runway 24 right and then continue the descent down to 10,000 feet. About 1.5 minutes later, the same controller then also asked the pilots if they had the airport in sight. Both pilots started peering out through the cockpit windows into the now dark evening and could just about make out the lights of the airport in the distance, as they were about 25 miles away at this point. The captain answered affirm, which prompted the controller to then clear them for a visual approach for runway 24 left, and he also told them to descend to cross an RNAV point called DNA at a minimum of 8,000 feet. When he heard this, the first officer disconnected the autopilot and then started visually transitioning over towards the center line for runway 24 left. The captain read back the clearance, but since they had been following the ILS localizer for runway 24 right up until this point, the first officer asked him to please confirm that the clearance actually was for runway 24 left and not right, which the captain then also did. The controller confirmed that they had heard right the first time, and the weather was absolutely great, so I'm sure that the first officer was really enjoying some hand flying here. I often disconnect a bit further out myself when the conditions are right to actually feel and enjoy the aircraft a bit. It's part of what makes this job so fun. Now, the two runways ahead of them were at the same distance, so even though there was no instrument landing system active for runway 24 left, the first officer could still use the glide slope indicator for the other runway as a way to help maneuver vertically. This had all of the hallmarks of a great approach, but what the pilots didn't know was that ahead of them, several now very unfortunate circumstances were starting to align with each other. At the same time as the USAIR Boeing 737 was lining up on a long final, SkyWest Flight 5569 had received their departure clearance and started up their engines. As they started taxiing out towards their departure runway, 24 left, the first officer completed the safety briefing with the passengers since there was no cabin crew on board. The aircraft proceeded from Terminal 6 via the north route to Gate 32 and then towards the holding point for runway 24 left. But because the Metroliner was a relatively small aircraft, they wouldn't need to taxi all the way down to the end of the runway for departure. Instead, they were planning to use what's known as an intersection takeoff position further up on the runway. We pilots often do this to minimize taxi time, and it's perfectly safe to do so as long as the performance has been calculated with that in mind. Now, at this point, we also have to start talking a bit about the air traffic controllers who were working this night and the way that they were dealing with the traffic. LAX had, like I mentioned before, 4 runways, and they were divided into 2 sets of parallel runway pairs. Runway 24 right and left made up the northern pair, and runway 25 right and left the southern. In between the runway pairs, the main terminal buildings were situated, and just to the east of them, the air traffic control tower. Inside the tower, there were 6 controllers working this afternoon. 4 fully qualified controllers, 1 developmental controller handling one of the ground frequencies, and 1 area supervisor. Now, when several air traffic controllers work together, they have to do so using some kind of organized system, and the way things were done back then, and mostly even today, is by the use of something known as flight progress strips. These strips are filled up with information about a particular flight and is then passed from one controller to the next when they hand over the aircraft between them. That way, the controller in charge of the aircraft knows that he or she have the responsibility for it, what clearance it has already received, and approximately in what sequence that aircraft is in relation to other traffic. Normally, those strips would then follow the same sequence as the handovers do, so from the clearance delivery to ground and then onto the tower controller who would be handling the takeoff. But at LAX, they had decided to change this slightly so that the strips would go from the clearance delivery controller directly to the tower controller in order to reduce some workload for the ground controllers. This meant that an aircraft could, at any time during taxi, get directly into contact with the tower and request, for example, an intersection takeoff. Now, this was very convenient for the crew of the aircraft, but it put a lot more workload on the tower controllers, who now had to, on top of separating landing and departing traffic, also sometimes look up and try to localize traffic on the airport in order to answer their requests. Now, the work of the controllers were done mostly visually, but they were also supposed to have some electronic aids at their disposal. One of those systems was called the Airport Surface Detection System, or ASDE, and was essentially a surface radar built to detect principal features of the airport, including aircraft and vehicles, and then present them on a radar screen for the controller. But this was a very crude system and prone to malfunctions, especially when used for longer periods of time, and on this particular afternoon it was not working. Another, more advanced and reliable system had been requested to replace it, but for some reason its implementation kept getting delayed, and that meant that on this afternoon there was no surface radar system available to help the active controller. Another factor that will play a role in this accident was the placement of the tower in relation to the northern runways. Since the tower was situated quite close to the runway 24 ends, the controller could see the beginning of the aircraft takeoff rolls perfectly, but as the aircraft started rolling further down the runway, 4 sets of ramp lights had been built to light up the ramp next to Terminal 2. These lights were constructed so high up and in such an angle that during the time of darkness, their glare would restrict the controller's view of the intersection 45 and 47 to runway 24 left. Now, this had been brought to the attention of someone who, according to verbal report, had apparently changed the angle of those lights. But even though this issue had been reported as solved, the glare was still there on the evening of February 1st. And then we get to the controller herself. The tower controller in charge on this evening had only been working in her position as a full performance level controller for about 2.5 months. About 1 month after her initial certification, she had undergone an assessment by her supervisor at the time as she was working in the tower, and this assessment was made in an effort to find weaknesses that could be used for further training events under something known as the Technical Appraisal Program, or TAP, and it was therefore not a pass or fail event. In the assessment, her supervisor identified a few key weaknesses in her performance, and those included a loss of awareness of aircraft separation, the misidentification of an aircraft by the use of an incorrect call sign, the failure to complete 2 required coordinations with other controllers, and a failure to issue a required advisory to an aircraft. These deficiencies was then debriefed with the controller after the check, but no other remedial action was taken, like extra training, for example, partially because the supervisor was unsure about how the TAP program was actually supposed to work. When SkyWest Flight 5569 had taxied about halfway towards their departure point, they were shifted over to a new ground controller frequency. The first officer advised this new controller that they were number 2 on taxiway Tango behind an Aeromexico aircraft ahead. The new controller acknowledged this and told them to hold position initially, and then, whenever ready, turn right onto Tango, and then at 45 transition to uniform and hold. 45 in this case was an intersection with runway 24 left, and as it turns out, it would suit flight 5569 perfectly as a starting point for their takeoff. The first officer read back the clearance, and then the Metroliner continued to taxi with the pilots inside completing their pre-flight takeoff procedures. Intersection 45 was situated just beyond the touchdown markings for runway 24 left and within the touchdown zone. It was also one of the intersections that were affected by those glaring light poles sticking up between the tower and the intersection. At time 18:03 and 38 seconds, the first officer in the Metroliner was advised to contact the tower on frequency 133.9. He did so, and when he called up, he advised the tower controller, SkyWest 569, at 45, we'd like to go from here if we can. The tower controller responded and told them to taxi up to and hold short of runway 24 left, which the first officer acknowledged. Now, so far, nothing was out of the ordinary here, and everything was still under control. The SkyWest crew was getting ready for an intersection takeoff like they almost always did at LAX, and the controller was well aware of where they were and in what sequence they were in the traffic. As this was happening, USAIR Flight 1493 was still on final and talking to the approach controller, so they didn't hear this initial conversation between the SkyWest aircraft and the tower. Now, remember how I said that air traffic controllers are using flight progress strips to keep track of their traffic? Well, the tower controller did have a strip for SkyWest Flight 5569, but the strip for another Metroliner, which was taxiing behind Flight 5569, had not been given to her due to an error by the clearance delivery controller. Remember that. Inside the cockpit of USAIR Flight 1493, the approach was going well, and the two pilots were in a really great mood. They were about 7 nautical miles out and had just selected gear down since the controller had asked them to expedite the descent down to 4,000 feet due to crossing traffic above them, and the drag from the extended gear would allow them to increase their descent rate without increasing their speed, which is important when you're on approach. Once they had passed 4,000 feet, the approach controller thanked them for their help and then told them to contact Los Angeles Tower on frequency 133.9, which the captain also read back. After this, the first officer started asking for flaps to be extended, the speed to be reduced, and for the landing checklist to be completed. Remember, he was still hand flying here, and the captain did all of this before calling up the tower. This meant that the time that they would have on the tower frequency became a bit shorter, but it was still long enough since they hadn't reached the mandatory reporting point yet. At time 18:04 and 33 seconds, USAIR Flight 1493 finally called up the tower controller and advised her that they were established on final inside of Roman, the outer marker position, about 5.3 nautical miles away from the runway. This call was received by the controller, but she never answered to it, and the reason for that was that she was now getting increasingly busy with a developing problem further down the runway. You see, just before Flight 1493 had called up, the tower controller had been dealing with an aircraft departing from runway 24 right, and just after that she was trying to reach another aircraft which was due to cross runway 24 left further down on the runway. But the pilots in that aircraft had managed to switch over to another frequency, which meant that the tower controller couldn't get a hold of them. As she was continuing to try and reach this aircraft, she also made a call to SkyWest Flight 5569, and she told them to taxi into position and hold runway 24 left, traffic crossing downfield. The first officer of Flight 5569 read back that clearance, released the brakes, and then started lining up on the active runway. Now, another important detail here is that the standard operating procedures in SkyWest at the time instructed the pilots to only turn on their landing and strobe lights once the takeoff clearance had been received. This meant that as the Metroliner was now lining up, the flashing strobe lights on the wings and tail was not yet activated. As the SkyWest aircraft started moving, the tower controller continued to try and reach the other aircraft to get them to cross the runway before the traffic situation made it impossible. At the same time, another aircraft, Southwest Airlines Flight 725, which is Boeing 737, came onto the frequency and told the controller that they were ready in sequence, meaning that they could accept the takeoff clearance whenever it was possible. The tower controller told them to continue taxiing down towards the holding point for runway 24 left and to hold position there, as they would get to follow the Metroliner in front of them after that. Now, what this exchange actually meant was that at this point, the controller's situational awareness was still intact. She knew that SkyWest Flight 5569 was on the runway awaiting takeoff clearance here. But now, as you can see, things are starting to become more complicated, as she was still trying to get into contact with that aircraft needing to cross the runway. At time 18:05 and 9 seconds, the missing aircraft finally came back onto the frequency and apologized for having messed up earlier. The tower controller told them that it was okay, and then she finally issued the clearance for them to cross the runway and to contact the ground controller when they were clear of the runway. The pilots read this back and then apologized again, to which the controller just repeated the same clearance, but with an incorrect call sign this time. A call sign that she had actually dealt with about 5 minutes earlier, and this could possibly have been an indication of her stress levels starting to rise. Remember, she still had one aircraft on the runway and another one on final, which was just getting closer and closer. Now, since the captain of Flight 1493 never got a response to his first call, he tried again at 18:05 and 29 seconds. But also this time, there was no response from the tower, who was now busy telling a departure aircraft to change their frequency. And just around here somewhere, something must have started to happen to the tower controller. Somewhere during the conversation with the crossing aircraft, the departing traffic and the USAIR flight on final, she must have forgotten about the SkyWest aircraft that was still waiting on the runway. She now asked the Southwest 737 to confirm that they were holding short of the runway, and when they did so, she cleared USAIR flight 1493 to land on runway 24 left. Now you might ask, how could she forget about an aircraft like this? Didn't she have a flight progress strip in front of her that was supposed to remind her? Well, the answer to that is yes, but unfortunately, the other Metroliner that I mentioned before, with call sign Westwing 5072, had now appeared on the frequency, and they did not have a strip, since the clearance delivery controller had forgotten to transfer that strip to her. This fact just further increased the workload, as she now had to start looking for that strip in the middle of everything else, and in that confusion, and with the number of strips in front of her matching with the only 2 aircraft that she could see, not the 3 that she actually had, because remember, that 3rd aircraft on the runway might still have been hidden behind those glaring lights, the error simply slipped through the crack, and there was no one there to notice it and no warning system available to notify her. Now, if air traffic control fails, the remaining safety barrier then becomes the pilots. This means that the 4 pilots involved in the situation, plus maybe others on the frequency, were now realistically the only ones that could stop this impending disaster. The pilots inside the Metroliner on the runway should have heard the tower clear the 737 behind them to land. Believe me, when you're standing on an active runway, you're really putting all your attention on that frequency, just awaiting your takeoff clearance. But there is of course a possibility that they were busy maybe completing the last part of their checklist or discussing something else. We would have known this if we had the cockpit voice recording from them, but unfortunately, this category of aircraft had not yet been mandated to carry a cockpit voice recorder at that time. There was a rule being implemented in October that same year, forcing the implementation of CVRs, and in a really cruel twist of fate, SkyWest had actually asked the FAA to allow them to install voice recorders early. When they did so, they had also asked the FAA to get an exception from the rule of being grounded if a CVR didn't work, up until the official implementation date, of course. But the FAA had just said no to that. If they installed those devices early, they would also need to work for the aircraft to be airworthy, and obviously the airline didn't want to take that extra risk. This, in my view, is red tape at its absolute worst. Anyway, that's why we won't know for sure why the pilots in the Metroliner didn't speak up when they heard the landing clearance of the aircraft behind them. But what about the pilots inside of the Boeing on final? Well, after they had received their landing clearance, the captains switched on their landing lights and made sure that the landing checklist was complete. They were completely stabilized as they passed 1,000 feet, and when they did so, the captain only made some remarks about how it was all looking real good. There were no discussions in the cockpit about any potential traffic conflicts. Now, that could have been because the Metroliner had only been cleared to taxi into position and hold less than 10 seconds after the 737 had joined that same frequency, meaning that that call, or the significance of it, might have been missed. There were also a lot of other calls around that same time, and the phraseology taxi into position and hold is somewhat ambiguous and could potentially refer to several different things. So there is a possibility that it didn't raise the type of awareness that a clear line up and wait clearance would have done. That's, by the way, why we today are very careful with using the exact phraseology intended for line up and takeoff clearances. But this still doesn't explain why the 737 pilots didn't see the Metroliner on the runway in front of them. The weather was fine and the visibility was great, even though it was completely dark at this point. But here another sad fact comes into play, one that I have already mentioned earlier on. Remember how SkyWest had as a procedure to not switch on those strobe lights until they had received their takeoff clearance? Well, what that meant was that the most conspicuous part of their aircraft lighting was now not activated. The aircraft would still have been reasonably easy to see when it was taxiing onto the runway and then lining up, but once it was standing still on the centerline, its white position lights would have blended in perfectly with the runway's centerline lights, and on top of that, remember what I told you about the red anti-collision light on top of the tail? Yeah, that one would have been easy to see during normal circumstances, but it was unfortunately partly hidden by the rudder cap behind and above it, just where the approaching 737 was now closing in. And since the runway edge lights, centerline and approach lights would have been much brighter than the non-illuminated aircraft fuselage, it would also have essentially been hidden. And all of these circumstances meant that the Metroliner was now effectively invisible as it was standing on the centerline bang in the middle of the touchdown zone. If it would have just lined up about 3 feet left or right of the centerline, it would have likely been another story, as the lights would have then been misaligned and much easier to see. Once the 737 passed 500 feet, the captain called out, "Up, you're coming out of 500 feet, bug plus 12, sink is 700. The first officer checked to that, and then he made sure that the landing lights were on and then started mentally preparing for the landing. He saw in the corner of his eye that another aircraft was taxiing towards them on taxiway uniform, but everything else looked perfectly fine. Now, we pilots normally aim for a point on the runway just before where we intend to touch down. So in this case, since it was dark outside, this would have likely been just in front of the main touchdown zone lights. Now we tend to use the poppy lights for initial vertical guidance, but as we get lower, more and more of our focus is instead directed towards that runway itself, making sure that the touchdown point is not moving up or down in the windows. This means that anything beyond that, especially if it's not supposed to be there and hard to see, would be very hard to notice by the pilot flying, and the pilot monitoring, which was the captain in this case, might have just been monitoring the instruments and therefore not have seen it. The threshold was passed at 50 feet with 130 knots, and the flare was then started at around 30 feet. The main landing gear touched down at the 1500 feet mark on the centerline, exactly where it should be, and the first officer then gently started de-rotating the nose to land the nose wheel, while simultaneously also selecting reverse thrust. But as he was doing this, his eyes suddenly caught a glimpse of a red light just in front of him, and almost immediately the whole Metroliner appeared in view with the glare of his landing lights reflected in its propellers. The first officer immediately applied max braking, but it was clearly too late, and there was no time to make any evasive maneuvering at all. The time has simply run out. At time 18:06 and 59 seconds, USAIR Flight 1493 collided with SkyWest Flight 5569 just a beam into section 45 on runway 24 left. The collision happened just as the nose gear of the 737 was touching down, with the main brunt of the impact hitting the lower left side of the Boeing's nose, causing a huge fireball. Since the Metroliner was substantially smaller and lower than the 737, it got completely crushed underneath the weight of the Boeing, which now started dragging the twisted wreckage along the runway. The nose gear of the Boeing soon collapsed, meaning that all directional control was instantly lost, and the sparks from the initial collision quickly ignited the fuel from the Metroliner, whose main body was now completely mangled on the left side wing of the 737. It is likely that all occupants of the Metroliner perished almost immediately from the initial collision, but inside of the Boeing, people were still alive. They had just noticed a seemingly normal landing, followed by abrupt braking and then a strong jolt as the impact happened. This was then immediately followed by severe vibrations, a strange clear orange glow outside of the windows, as well as heat and smoke that quickly started coming up from below the floor. When the cabin crew first saw this, the two that were seated in the rear of the aircraft unbuckled their seatbelts to start getting ready for what they assumed would be an immediate evacuation. And so did several passengers. But the problem here was that this accident was still not over. The two aircraft were still moving at a considerable speed, and since the pilots now had no way of controlling the trajectory, the flaming wreckage soon left the runway and careened over towards the left, where they crossed two taxiways before finally crashing into an abandoned fire station. As that happened, the two aircraft obviously came to an immediate stop, meaning that all of those people who had unbuckled their seatbelts now flew forward and into their seats, aisles and bulkheads. This is the reason why you need to keep your seatbelt fastened until we pilots turn off the seatbelt sign or the cabin crew tells you to. Fortunately though, the two flight attendants that had unbuckled themselves didn't hurt themselves badly and were able to reasonably quickly come to their senses again. The impact with the building had completely mangled the forward left part of the cockpit, likely killing the captain immediately. And the fire that was now raging below the fuselage soon got into contact with the crew oxygen cylinder that I mentioned before. That cylinder had likely been damaged in the initial impact and now started spewing pure oxygen into the fuel-fed fire, drastically increasing its intensity. Black smoke was now quickly filling up the cabin, making the evacuation both more urgent and harder to do. And the fire, which soon also entered the cabin, could spread relatively easy in the older type overhead bins and wall panels. The flight attendant in the front managed to soon open the forward right door, but the main evacuation route quickly became the overwing exit on the right-hand side away from the fire. The back left door had been partially opened with the slide deployed by the eager cabin crew while the aircraft was still moving, meaning that it was now inoperative. And the back right door was being used, but that area soon filled with dense black smoke. Now, remember that emergency briefing that the flight attendant had done with the 17-year-old boy sitting next to the overwing exit? Well, it now turns out that this briefing likely saved several lives, as the passengers clearly remembered what they had to do and therefore quickly got that door open. Unfortunately though, one passenger who was sitting in that emergency row froze from pure fear, impeding the speed of the evacuation, and on top of that, two other passengers at some point started fighting in front of the exit, slowing it down even further. This, together with a slightly damaged seat in front of the exit, meant that some passengers and one cabin crew who was trying to help them sadly didn't have time to exit before they were overcome by the smoke. Out of the 83 passengers and 6 crew on board the 737, 22 perished and 13 received serious injuries. On top of that, all 12 passengers and crew on board the Metroliner had also perished, meaning that the total death toll with this horrible accident actually rose to 34, with one more added a few days later as a passenger died from his injuries. Now, in the tower, the controllers had immediately hit the accident button as soon as that first fireball was seen, but initially there was quite some confusion about what had actually caused it. The fire brigade quickly arrived to the scene and did an absolutely outstanding job. They helped with the evacuation, of course, and one of them actually climbed into the right-hand cockpit window and managed to pull out the first officer and thereby saving his life. Another firefighter found a propeller inside of the right-hand engine of the 737 and called this into the tower, as they initially hadn't been made aware that there were 2 aircraft involved in this accident. This information then finally made it clear to everyone what had happened, and SkyWest Flight 5569 was quickly identified as the aircraft that had likely been hit. When the investigation started, it showed that the accident was caused by a failure of air traffic control management at LAX to implement proper procedures to provide redundancy in case an individual controller would make a mistake. Specifically, the local decision to allow that flight progress strips to bypass the ground controller was deemed as highly inappropriate. This, together with some other deficient procedures, had then ultimately led to the tower controller losing her situational awareness and issuing that fatal landing clearance, which ultimately caused the crash. The recommendations that came out of this horrible accident focused on improving ATC procedures, specifically around intersection takeoffs, and reinforcing the need for clear and unambiguous phraseology, as well as for pilots to actively monitor the ATC frequency for potential threats. This also clearly showed the need for the implementation of crew resource management (CRM) courses, which would cover things like communication and threat awareness, both of which were involved in this case. It was also later found that the captain of the USAIR aircraft had been using off-the-shelf medication without clearing that with his AME, and even though that had no impact on this accident, it was recommended to further highlight the potential dangers of doing this to the pilots out there. Now, one procedure that also came directly from this accident, which we all are using today, is to switch on the strobe lights whenever we enter a runway, no matter if it's active or not, and to also consider lining up slightly off the center line to make the aircraft more visible for traffic around. Two fully loaded Boeing 747s are taxiing through the thick fog on the runway, preparing for takeoff. In a few moments, something will happen that will shock the world. How was this possible? Stay tuned. The story about the Tenerife airport disaster is filled with, frankly, incredible coincidences. Let's see at the end of this video if you can list all of the things that, if they would have just happened slightly differently, this disaster could have been avoided. The chain of events starts on the 26th of March 1977 when Pan Am Flight 1736, which is a Boeing 747-100 with call sign Clipper 1736, takes off from Los Angeles International Airport with original destination New York to pick up some passengers and then fly down to Las Palmas in the Canary Islands. This flight is chartered by Royal Cruise Lines, and because it's a charter flight, it's completely fully booked on its last leg, and it's mostly elderly passengers who are due to get onto a cruise ship when they reach Las Palmas. Las Palmas is the capital of the Canary Islands and is situated on Gran Canaria, which is one of the 8 main islands of the island group. The Canary Islands is situated about 100 kilometers west of the Moroccan coastline, making it the most southern part of the Spanish territory. And because of its tropical and subtropical climate, it's a real hotspot for tourists from mainly Europe, but all over the world. Now, the Canary Islands back in 1977 had a little bit of political friction going on. A group called the MPA-IAC was fighting for independence of the Canary Islands from Spain, or at least to get a little bit of recognition and attention by the central government. Now, they did so using both non-violent and violent political campaigns. And one of those campaigns is going to form the first piece of the puzzle leading up to this disaster. In command of Pan Am Flight 1736 was 56-year-old Captain Victor Grubbs. Assisting him was 38-year-old First Officer Robert Bragg and 46-year-old flight engineer George Warnes. They were a very, very experienced flight crew, and they took over the flight in New York for the final leg down towards Las Palmas. When the aircraft arrived in New York, it was actually about 45 minutes delayed, which meant that the outbound flight down towards Las Palmas also became slightly delayed. At time 0742, Clipper 1736 took off from JFK International Airport in New York and started flying down over the Atlantic Ocean towards Las Palmas. On board there was a total of 16 crew members and 380 passengers. While the Pan Am aircraft was making its way down over the Atlantic, another Boeing 747, a KLM Flight 4805, was getting ready to depart from Amsterdam down towards Las Palmas Airport. This was also a charter flight, chartered by Holland International Travel Group, and they were due to take their passengers from Amsterdam, bring them down to Las Palmas, and then make a turnaround down there, refill the aircraft, get new passengers on, and then fly back to Amsterdam as KLM Flight 4806, making it a fairly long day for the involved crew. In charge of these two flights was Captain Jacob Veldhuisen van Santen. He was 50 years old at the time, and he was working as the chief flight instructor on the Boeing 747 fleet for KLM. This meant that he spent quite a lot of his operating hours in the simulator instructing other pilots, and maybe not as much time in the actual aircraft. One of the pilots that had been trained on the type by Captain Jacob van Santen, and indeed had been checked out by him just a few months earlier, was First Officer Klaus Meers, who was going to be flying together with van Santen on this afternoon. Together with them was also flight engineer Wilhelm Schröder, and Wilhelm Schröder was very experienced, and he was also known to not be afraid to speak his mind, something that we'll see soon enough. At 9 o'clock sharp on the 27th of March 1977, KLM flight 4805 took off from Schiphol, Amsterdam International Airport, with 14 crew members and 234 passengers on board, and started its travel down towards Las Palmas. As these two aircraft was now making their way down towards their destination, two young men walked into the terminal building in Las Palmas airport. They walked up to the flower shop that was close to the check-in desks, and they stood there for a while before they turned around and hurriedly went outside of the terminal building. Behind, they left a bag, and what no one noticed at the time was that the bag was ticking. At exactly 1 o'clock in the afternoon, a desk clerk inside of Las Palmas airport received a phone call from someone claiming that they were a representative of the MPAIAC, saying that there were bombs put inside of the terminal building and that they had exactly 15 minutes to clear the entire building out. Almost to the second, 15 minutes later, the bomb that was placed inside of the bag next to the flower shop exploded. This caused part of the roof inside of the terminal building to fall down and other widespread damage, as well as injuring 4 people inside of the building. But remember how the person who called said that there were bombs, as in plural? Well, now the authorities needed to assume that there was more than one bomb inside of the building, so they needed to search it. And because of that, a decision was taken to stop all inbound flights into Las Palmas airport. Almost exactly at the same time as this was happening down on the ground, KLM flight 4805 arrived into a holding pattern above Las Palmas. Initially, they were told to hold, to wait, but pretty soon they were told that we don't know how long this holding is going to take or how long the cleanup is going to take, so you need to divert toward Los Rodeos airport in Tenerife. This meant a short 25-minute flight over towards Los Rodeos, and at time 13:38, the KLM 747 touched down on runway 30 in Los Rodeos airport. They taxied up until almost the terminal building, as far north as they could on the apron, and they parked there. As the KLM flight was diverting, Pan Am flight 1736 had also entered a holding pattern a few thousand feet above the KLM aircraft. They heard the news about the bomb, just like the KLM flight did, and they also asked if they potentially could hold instead of diverting, because they were also holding a lot of extra fuel on board. But just like the KLM flight, the Pan Am flight was also told that no, we will not have any aircraft in our airspace, so please divert over towards Los Rodeos airport. So they did, and they landed at time 14:15, about 37 minutes after the KLM flight, and also taxied to the apron. And at this point, Los Rodeos airport had started to fill up with all of the inbound flights that were supposed to come into Las Palmas, who was now being diverted, which meant that both the apron and the taxiways was now becoming quite crowded with diverted flights. Now let's talk a little bit about the airport that these two aircraft have just diverted to. Los Rodeos airport is situated up in the northeastern corner of Tenerife. It's situated up on a hill at an altitude of about 2,000 feet. Now, Tenerife is dominated by the biggest mountain in Spain, actually, which is a volcano called Pico de Teide. And Pico de Teide creates some quite unique meteorological phenomenon where these humid trade winds that are coming in from the Atlantic is getting pushed up against the mountainside. And when it does so, that cools down, the moisture falls out and start forming clouds or fog, and that can happen really, really quickly. This also means that down on the southern side of Tenerife, it's almost always sunny. So the kind of weather that you associate with going to the Canary Islands is down south. But up in the north, it's almost always humid. There's a lot of rain. It's a lot greener. There's a lot of vegetation there. And because the airport is situated at 2,000 feet altitude, it means that even reasonably high clouds, so 2,000 feet high clouds, when they come in over the airport, they touch ground. And this causes a very interesting phenomenon where it's not quite fog, because when you think of fog, you think of something where the visibility stays more or less the same over time, right? Maybe it's 500 meters visibility and it stays the same. But because what you have here is actually sometimes rolling clouds that are coming in and disappearing, you can have really big variations in visibility, where there's maybe 2-3 kilometers visibility in 1 minute, and 3 minutes later it's down to 300 meters. When these two aircraft arrived into Tenerife, the visibility was good. It was a good day. But that very quickly started changing, and that's what we're coming to in a minute. Another thing about Los Rodeos Airport is that it had a very poor safety record. Between the years of 1965 and 1968, there was on average 1 crash per year in the airport or in the surroundings, claiming 98 lives. And just a few years before this disaster, there had been another serious accident happen. Because of this, a decision had been taken to build a new airport down in the southern part of Tenerife instead, where the weather was much better. This airport was actually paved and almost ready to take into use in 1977, but because of some political infighting, that hadn't happened yet. This new airport down south actually had ground radar, but Tenerife North, Los Rodeos Airport, did not have ground radar at the time of the accident. When the KLM flight pulled up and parked next to the terminal building, initially Captain Van Santen and his crew wanted all of the passengers to stay on board. I'm guessing he probably was hoping that this was just going to be a very short ground delay and that they could depart towards Las Palmas almost immediately. But after about 20 minutes it became clear that this was not going to be the case, and he decided that the passengers could disembark, go into the terminal building, stretch their legs a little bit, maybe grab something at the bar, and he issued them with reboarding passes so that they quickly could get back onto the aircraft if they were told that Las Palmas had opened again. The Pan Am aircraft that came in a little bit later wanted to do the same thing, but were told that the terminal building was now completely full with all of the KLM passengers and that it wouldn't be good to mix the two. So the Pan Am crew decided to keep everyone on board, but they did ask for steps to be brought up towards the aircraft so that the passengers could go up onto the steps, stretch their legs a little bit, get some fresh air while they were waiting. The KLM passengers stayed inside of the terminal building for about 2 hours before they were reboarded. In the Pan Am cockpit, the crew tried to make the best out of the situation. Captain Grubbs made a PA telling all of the passengers that those who wanted could come in and visit the flight deck, and he was guiding them around, showing, this marvelous aircraft. This is the Boeing 747 to them, and the spirit was quite good, even though they had been working for a long time at this point. In the KLM cockpit, though, the mood was very different, because Captain Van Santen and his first officer and flight engineer had started talking about the recent changes in Dutch flight time limitation legislation. Up until recently, before 1977, there had been quite lax rules regarding how long a pilot could work. But recently those rules had changed dramatically, and there was now very clear limits to how long you were allowed to operate. And if you as a captain went outside of these limitations, you would face a judge and potentially serve jail time. And this is what they were discussing, because they could clearly see that if the ground delay would become much longer, well, then they would have to go very quickly over towards Las Palmas, have minimum delay there in order to be able to return to Amsterdam and land within these limitations. This made the flight crew quite anxious. Right? They did not want to get stuck on Las Palmas. Captain Van Santen had his wife at home and his 2 children, and he said specifically that he was afraid that his wife was going to hear the news about the bomb in Las Palmas and become very, very worried if she knew that he was down there and he was overnighting there. So they were really looking into ways that they could minimize the delay as much as possible to get themselves back towards Amsterdam. And this is where Captain Van Santen takes a decision that's going to have very dire consequences. Because he decides that if he's going to be sitting on the ground here he might as well be uploading as much fuel as he needs to fly over to Las Palmas and to fly back to Amsterdam. That way he's going to minimize the time on the ground in Las Palmas. This is a very sound decision. This is something I completely understand myself, because if you're stuck there, why not utilize the time to upload the fuel? But once you start the fueling of a 747, it's a fairly big operation. It's not something that you want to stop. So he was kind of gambling on that this delay was going to take another hour or so for them to be able to complete their fueling process. And crucially, this fueling process was also going to make his jet about 15% more heavy. That would mean that he would need a higher speed in order to take off later on, and also a longer takeoff distance. Only minutes after Captain Van Santen has initiated refueling of his jet, he gets notice that Las Palmas has now opened again, that they could go and fly over. Weather is still good, but now lower clouds starting to roll in from the hills, and the visibility is getting worse minute by minute. Captain Grubbs in the Pan Am flight has heard the same message, and he asks for startup, but he is told that unfortunately now the KLM flight is fueling and there is not enough ground clearance for him to be able to maneuver his jet up and past the KLM flight in order to enter the runway and backtrack for departure. He's going to have to wait for the KLM flight to finish refueling and for them to depart before he is allowed to taxi out and take off. When Captain Grubbs heard this, he went out onto the radio frequency and he said, "How long is this fueling going to take?" And Captain Van Santen responded from the KLM cockpit saying that it's going to take another 20 minutes to half an hour. Captain Grubbs in the Pan Am cockpit was not happy with this. Instead, he sent out his flight engineer and his first officer to physically measure whether or not they could squeeze by the KLM jet on the apron. But when they came back in, they confirmed that the distance was not big enough. It was less than 20 feet short, but it was short. So they would have to sit and wait until the KLM had finished refueling. At the same time, all of the passengers and crew had returned back to the KLM aircraft and were now getting ready for departure. All except one. Mrs. Robina Monique van Lanschot was a worker for the company that had chartered the flights in the first place, and she had her boyfriend actually living on Tenerife. So she had, during the ground time, checked if she could possibly stay there together with him instead of taking the flight back towards Las Palmas, and that was granted. So at the time all of the other passengers were boarding the flight, she was already in the car getting away from the airport together with her boyfriend, and that is going to turn her into a very rare statistic. At time 16:45, the KLM aircraft had finished refueling and the last pieces of paperwork were delivered to the cockpit. Captain Van Santen and his crew was now trying to complete the before start checklist, and you could hear on the cockpit voice recorder how Captain Van Santen is actually trying to slow things down. He was saying things like, "Hey, give the man a chance," indicating that the first officer was working on his scan flow at the same time as the checklist was being read. But even though he was trying to moderate the pace, he was then heard just a few minutes later and before the checklist had been completed, calling for startup clearance. And this is something that's normally done by the first officer. So the fact that Captain Van Santen was doing this himself indicate that he was also indeed trying to speed things up. At time 16:56, the KLM crew had finished starting up their engines and they now were ready to taxi. They went on to the ground controller frequency and were cleared to taxi into holding position for runway 12. When they approached the holding position, they got transferred over to the approach controller, and the approach controller cleared them to enter runway 12, backtrack and then turn off the runway on the third exit on their left-hand side. The first officer read this back, but instead of reading back the third exit, he read back the first exit, which is kind of easy to understand because third and first can sound very similar, especially on the radio frequency. When the approach controller heard this misunderstanding, he changed his mind and he changed the clearance to just backtrack all the way, runway 12, until you reach the end of the runway, make a 180-degree turn and then hold position. This was read back by the first officer, but only a few seconds later, Captain Van Santen came onto the same frequency and asked whether or not he should turn left onto Charlie 1, which is, once again, the first exit on the left-hand side. The approach controller said, "No, continue taxi straight ahead." Okay, he said, fine. He continued taxiing down, but when they passed taxiway Charlie 4, which is the fourth exit on the left-hand side, Van Santen again turned over in the cockpit to his first officer and asked whether he should turn off there. This can maybe be interpreted as a little bit of confusion in the KLM cockpit at this time, but with my experience, when you're taxiing in low visibility conditions, it's very, very hard actually. You see very little. It's actually a quite scary situation where you only see a few lights. And in this case, the centerline lights of the runway wasn't working either. So it's quite common that you, as a captain, keep asking your first officers to confirm the taxi routing, confirm if we should turn this. Whether you have the slightest little doubt about where you are or what you should do, you always ask. So I didn't find that very strange. But it is also possible that Captain Van Santen is now starting to think ahead, and he's starting to think about the flight over to Las Palmas, the potential of delays in Las Palmas, and then the flight back towards Amsterdam and the flight time limitations. And he could start to become a bit distracted. And if that's the case, well, then that could indicate that he's actually losing a little bit of current situational awareness because he is thinking ahead, something that we captains also tend to do, especially when there's trouble brewing. And that could explain the actions that he's about to take next. As the KLM aircraft was taxiing now, the visibility was indicated to be around 500 meters, which is quite bad visibility. But some witnesses at the airport estimated that it could be at times as low as 100 meters, because they were now in that type of situation that we were talking about before, where there was low clouds that was moving over the runway. And this meant that at times the visibility was really poor, and then one of these clouds could move out of the way and the visibility could improve quite significantly. And this was also indicated because the cockpit voice recorder indicates that the windshield wipers in the KLM cockpit was on for a couple of minutes, but as the aircraft was reaching the end of the runway and started to turn around, they actually turned off the windshield wiper, indicating that the visibility possibly was a little bit better at that part of the runway. At the same time as the KLM aircraft is now backtracking the runway, Clipper 1736, the Pan Am 747, receives their startup clearance. They start up all of their 4 engines and they request taxi clearance, and as they're now taxiing out towards the same holding position for runway 12, Captain Grubbs is indicating to his fellow flight crew members that he would actually like to stay off the runway, to wait until the KLM flight has departed instead of backtracking behind them. Unfortunately, this is never really transmitted onto air traffic control, because as he is talking about this, they get several radio calls and also a frequency change. And when they change over to the approach frequency, which is the same frequency as the KLM aircraft is on, the approach controller gives them the clearance to enter runway 12, backtrack, and then turn the 3rd exit towards the left of the runway, which is the same clearance as they originally gave to the KLM aircraft. Now you might ask yourself, if Captain Grubbs did not want to enter the runway, if he wanted to wait behind, why didn't he insist on doing that? Well, that can possibly be explained by the fact that when we're flying into countries where English is not the first language, and when you're speaking to a controller that you can hear has a strong accent and maybe struggling a bit with English, well, then sometimes flight crew members accept clearances that is not their first choice, just in order to make sure that there are no further confusions happening by starting a discussion. And Captain Grubbs actually, in subsequent interviews, indicated that, yeah, that was definitely part of his thinking. In any case, as the aircraft is now entering and backtracking the runway, still in fog, there is discussions going on in the cockpit about which exit they were supposed to take. Once again, they're not sure whether or not they should take Charlie 1, which is the first exit to the left, or the 3rd exit to the left. Exactly the same discussion as the KLM crew had before. Another really important thing to understand about Tenerife is the way that the taxiways are built. So the 3rd exit on the left-hand side, coming from this direction, is actually what we call a high-speed turnoff from the landing runway 30 direction. This means that it's a nice turnoff when you're coming from that direction, but if you backtrack the runway, like these 2 aircraft did, it would require a very steep 148-degree turn to the left, followed by another 148-degree turn to the right to follow the parallel taxiway. That might be possible for a smaller aircraft, but for a large aircraft like the 747, it would be practically impossible, especially the 2nd turn onto the taxiway. And this is why the flight crew members, when they're discussing this, they're actually talking about maybe the controller meant Charlie 4 rather than Charlie 3, so the 4th exit on the left. This is a high-speed turnoff from runway 12, which gives a nice 35-degree turnoff from the runway and would make much more sense. Before the Pan Am crew could get on to the frequency and confirm which taxiway they were supposed to turn left on, the approach controller actually came in and he asked, KLM 4805, can you confirm which taxiway you just passed? First officer in the KLM flight came back and said, yeah, we think that we've just passed Charlie 4, indicating that the visibility was still quite bad. Now, I want you to note that the approach controller frequently made pauses in his transmission. So he started off the transmission and then he held it there for a while until he continued, indicating that he might have to think a little bit about what he was about to say. And this is going to have a disastrous consequence in just a few minutes from now. At time 17:03 and 29 seconds, the Pan Am first officer came onto the frequency and asked, confirm we are to taxi off on the third exit, really putting emphasis on the word third. The approach controller came in and said, affirm, taxi off on the third exit, 1, 2, 3, third. Pan Am answered, okay, thank you. And this is important because the cockpit voice recorder in the KLM cockpit indicated that at this specific time there was complete silence inside of the cockpit, indicating that the flight crew members was listening out to the frequency. And there is a possibility that what they thought they heard was that the Clipper 1736, the Pan Am aircraft, was looking at the exit they were about to turn onto and calling air traffic control just to confirm that this was the correct exit that they needed to take. In that case, this aircraft was just about to turn off the runway. In reality, the Clipper 1736 was just calling to confirm which taxiway they were about to take. They were much further down the runway. In the Pan Am cockpit, there was a relaxed atmosphere. They were making jokes in Spanish, saying uno, dos, tres, kind of indicating that they were going to take the first, second, the third exit on the left-hand side. And they also at this point started doing their before takeoff checklist. The cockpit voice recorder in the Pan Am aircraft indicates that the pilots were looking out to see the taxiways as they passed. They call out things like, there is one, there's the second one. But curiously, there is no mentioning of the third one, which is what they were cleared to taxi off on. And the reason for that is possibly because they were listening out to the ATC frequency just as KLM started receiving their departure clearance. They have never been to this airport before. They were probably very interested in hearing what kind of clearance this aircraft was going to get, since they were going to do the exact same flight. And it is very possible that all of the flight crew members, as they were taxiing through the fog, when KLM was receiving their route clearance, was just focusing on that clearance, and they missed the third taxiway, the one that they were supposed to turn off on, and continued taxi down the runway towards the fourth exit. At time 17:03 and 47 seconds, the approach controller comes onto the frequency and says, 7135, report when leaving the runway. Now, this is the incorrect call sign for the Pan Am flight, but they understand that it's for them, and they just respond 1736. This is a common way of accepting, basically the same as saying Wilco. But the problem here is that if you are in another aircraft in the mindset that your only obstacle on the runway just saw their turn off, and then you hear this message, you might misinterpret that as a confirmation of being clear of the runway, rather than a confirmation of going to report when we are clear of the runway. We will never know if this is what happened in the KLM cockpit, but it is likely that something like this did happen. A few seconds later, the approach controller once again comes on to the frequency and gives a message to both the KLM flight crew and the Pan Am flight crew. And he says that the centerline lights are out of service. He did this in response to an earlier question that Captain Van Santen had asked regarding if they could get centerline lights. And the significance of this is that without centerline lighting, your minimum visibility that you're required to have in order to do a takeoff actually goes up quite a lot. It goes up to over 800 meters. This was discussed inside of the Pan Am cockpit, but it wasn't discussed in the KLM cockpit, and that could potentially be because at the point they were at the runway, the visibility might be much better than it was where the Pan Am flight crew was. 2,000 meters away from the Pan Am aircrafts, at the very end of the runway, KLM flight 8504 has now completed its 180 degrees turnaround and is facing straight down into the takeoff direction. As soon as the turn is complete, Captain Jacob van Santen starts advancing his thrust levels to stabilize them for takeoff. But here is where his first officer, Mers, cuts in and says, "Wait a minute, we haven't got any clearance." Captain van Santen reduces his thrust back to idle again and just says, "I know that, go ahead, ask." First Officer Mers, in a little bit of a hurry, goes onto the frequency and says, KLM 8504, we are ready for takeoff and we are waiting for ATC clearance. By saying it this way, it can be construed that First Officer Mers is asking both for a takeoff clearance and en route clearance at the same time. Remember, they haven't received the clearance, which is how they are supposed to navigate after they depart. They need to have that before they depart, but they also need to get takeoff clearance in order to start the takeoff roll. The approach controller comes in, he has been waiting for the KLM crew to ask for ATC clearance, and he gives them the following clearance. KLM 8705, once again the wrong call sign. You are cleared to the Papa Beacon, climb to and maintain flight level 90, right turn after takeoff to proceed on heading 040 degrees to intercept radial 325 toward Las Palmas VOR. This clearance includes the word takeoff. In the mind of Captain Jacob van Santen, who thinks that the runway is now completely clear and that this clearance both gives him the clearance for takeoff and en route clearance, responds with a "Ja" and start advancing the thrust levels. First Officer Mers, who's had to read this clearance back, you can hear on the cockpit voice recorder, is getting quite stressed, and he reads back, "Roger sir, we are cleared to the Papa Beacon, flight over 90, right turn 050 degrees until intercepting 325, and we are now at takeoff." While he is still reading this clearance back, Captain van Santen has said, "Let's go, check thrust," and advanced the thrust level to the takeoff position. This is likely why he added on, "We are now at takeoff," or "We are taking off." It has been impossible during the examination of the cockpit voice recorder to actually hear exactly what it is that he says, but in any case, it definitely said under stress. The time is now 17:06 and 11 seconds, and in about 39 seconds the worst aviation disaster in history is about to happen. But at this point there are still 3 things that could have potentially stopped it from happening. Because as the approach controller hears the readback from the first officer, he interprets the "we are at takeoff" as in "we are at takeoff position," which is what he is expecting them to say. So he responds with "okay," and then he waits a few seconds and "stand by for takeoff, I will call you." But the Pan Am aircraft, who is still taxiing down the runway, they think that they hear that the KLM aircraft is about to take off. So the first officer goes in, and at the same time as the approach controller is calling on the frequency, he also calls and he says, "We are still taxiing down the runway, Clipper 1736. The problem is that those 2 messages, when they're being transmitted at the same time, causes interference on the frequency. So the only thing that is heard in the KLM cockpit is the ATC controller's "okay," and then a really shrill noise comes out. None of the 2 other stations that were calling, not the controller, not the aircraft, could hear this shrill noise. So this means that effectively KLM has only heard "okay." The approach controller now thinks that he has given a fairly clear message to the KLM aircraft, and he refocuses his attention on the Pan Am aircraft instead. And he calls them saying, "Papa Alpha 1736, confirm when you're clear of the runway." Clipper 1736 comes back and said, "Affirm, we will confirm when we are clear of the runway, Clipper 1736. As these messages are being sent out on the frequency, the KLM aircraft is now accelerating down the runway. And as the speed builds up, they're likely getting into worse visibility. This requires more focus and more attention by the pilots, but one of the pilots, the flight engineer Schröder, he actually has a little bit lower workload at this point, and he listens into these radio messages. And at time 17:06:30, he leans forward and says, "So, are they not clear of the runway then?" Captain Van Santen, who is deeply focused on the takeoff role, doesn't hear what he says at first, so he says, "What did you say?" And flight engineer Schroeder says, "So, is it not clear of the runway then, the Pan Am?" Now, Captain Santen just says in a very convincing voice, "Oh yes." And those were the last three things that could have stopped this disaster from happening. In the Pan Am cockpit, the pilots have now passed the third taxiway to the left that they were supposed to leave on, and they're now taxiing down towards the fourth exit instead. The mood in the cockpit is actually quite relaxed, and they're making fun a little bit about the KLM captain and his perceived impatience at this point, because they have been the ones who've been waiting for him to finish fueling. At time 17:06:38, this is 11 seconds prior to the collision, Captain Grubbs is looking out through his windshield and he starts to see the headlights of the KLM aircraft. Initially, he thinks that they're standing still, so he just says, "Oh, there he is." But very quickly he understands that these headlights are not standing still, and he exclaims, "Oh, God damn it, that son of a bitch is coming, he's coming!" First Officer Braggs responds with, "Get off, get off!" And Captain Grubbs just gives full tiller to the left, tries to get his jet out into the grass and away from the oncoming 747. He adds full thrust, but his aircraft weighs about 340 tons and it will not accelerate that quickly. The highest speed that they managed to get up to prior to the collision is about 20 knots. In the KLM cockpit, Captain Van Santen has heard V1 and he's just getting ready to start rotating his aircraft for takeoff when he suddenly sees the silhouette of the now turning Pan Am 747 straight ahead of him. He reacts by pulling his yoke all the way to the back, causing a tail strike at the back of the aircraft, leaving about 20 meters of metal scrapings on the runway. The last words that he says is a Dutch profanity, "Oh God, verdomme!" as the aircraft gets momentarily airborne just a second prior to the collision. The number 4 engine, situated on the right-hand wing of the KLM jet, now slices into the first-class lounge of the Pan Am jet, which is the upper part of the bulge of the 747. The main landing gear tears into the body as the left wing tears off the empennage and the fin of the Pan Am jet, causing severe destruction. The KLM jet continues to fly for another 150 meters or so before it sinks back onto the runway, this time without its landing gear, which has been torn off in the collision. The jet continues to slide for another couple of 100 meters, slightly to the right of centerline, turning slightly clockwise as it does. But as soon as it touches down, a wild fire breaks out and all 248 passengers and crew on board are lost. In the Pan Am aircraft, there's now complete pandemonium. Most passengers did not have time to even understand what happened. And in the cockpit, all 3 pilots have actually managed to survive the initial impact. But as the flight engineer is grabbing for the fire handles in the roof to try to turn off the engines, he finds himself just grabbing in thin air because that part of the cockpit roof had been torn off in the collision. All of the passengers that were seated in the first class lounge died on impact. And most of the passengers who actually survived actually managed to get out of holes in the body from the first class lounge below that bulge and the cockpit. They couldn't open the emergency exit because the whole structure of the aircraft had been severely bent by the impact. And they found themselves having to jump out, and that's a jump of almost 20 feet or 6 meters down onto the asphalt. Some passengers also managed to escape from the back of the aircraft through a hole in the roof, climbing out onto the wings and then down onto the asphalt from there. But out of the 396 people on board the Pan Am aircraft, only 61 survived the crash. The air traffic controller has no idea that this tragic event has happened because, remember, the airport is not equipped with ground radar and the visibility during this event was so poor that there was absolutely no chance for him to see from the tower that this happened. If this would have happened just a few minutes later, the visibility would have gone up so far that it's unlikely that the event would have taken place in the first place. In any case, one of the aircraft that was sitting on a taxiway reported that they could see flames on the runway. This prompted the air traffic controller to hit the alarm button, which sent out the rescue team out onto the runway. But the firefighters had to drive really slowly because of the fog to make sure that they didn't run over someone on the runway. The first thing they noticed of the accident was immense radiation heat as they got closer to the accident site. Then, out of the fog, they could see the outline of this huge 747 now fully engulfed in flames, which was the KLM jet. They started fighting this fire, but they also realized that further down the runway it looked like there was another fire going, and they assumed that this was just a part of the KLM jet. Anyway, they split their forces in two, and one part of the firefighting force went down and realized very quickly that they were looking at yet another Boeing 747 that was also on flames. Now, they've very quickly realized that there was nothing they could do on the KLM. It was completely consumed by fire at this point. So they put their forces in to try to rescue as much as they could on the Pan Am jet. And they managed, through the use of extensive water and foam, to secure a large quantity of aviation fuel that had gotten out onto the runway and kept it from igniting, which likely saved a lot of people that was now evacuating out of the Pan Am jet. This horrendous accident shocked the whole world, and the investigation started immediately. Fortunately, they could get a hold of the cockpit voice recorder and flight data recorder from both aircraft relatively quickly, and in the Spanish final report they pushed most of the blame onto the KLM captain, Captain Jacob van Santen. It stated that the accident was caused by the KLM captain taking off without an ATC clearance, not stopping the takeoff when air traffic control told him to stand by for takeoff, not stopping the takeoff when the Pan Am aircraft reported that they were still on the runway, and also not abandoning the takeoff when his own flight engineer asked him whether or not the Pan Am aircraft was still on the runway. Now, the Dutch investigation team had a slightly different view than what was stated in the final report from the Spanish. They didn't question the cause of the accident, which was clearly that the KLM crew had taken off without a takeoff clearance. But instead, they delved a little bit deeper into why this happened. How come that an experienced captain like Captain Jacob van Santen would take a decision like that? And they looked into suboptimal teamwork between the cockpit crews in both aircraft and air traffic control, possibly due to language barriers, but they also looked into whether or not the ATC controller might have been slightly distracted. There was some noise indicated on the ATC tapes that would have indicated that the controller might have been potentially looking at a football game at the same time. They also looked into the psychological factors that could have influenced the crew in the KLM cockpit to have taken the decisions that they took. Now, I know that a lot of the stories, movies, videos and books that has been made about this horrendous accident has focused a lot of attention on the power distance in the cockpit of the KLM jet between the very experienced training captain, Captain Jacob van Santen, and his first officer, Meurs. And the fact that his first officer wouldn't feel comfortable in speaking up against his captain. But that kind of takes away from the fact that First Officer Meurs was far from a new pilot. He had 9,200 hours. He was new on the 747, but he was a very experienced pilot. And he did speak up. Remember when Captain van Santen wanted to start the takeoff roll as soon as he turned the aircraft around? It was First Officer Meurs who spoke up and said, no, stop, hold on, we need to get our ATC clearance. And that would indicate that he definitely was able to speak up against Captain van Santen. And the fact that Van Santen started his takeoff roll while he was still reading back the ATC clearance definitely disturbed him, but it is very likely that he still thought that the runway ahead was clear, that there was no danger, and what Van Santen was doing was a procedural mistake, but nothing more than that. And this is why I think it was very important that the Dutch investigation team actually did add their notes onto this final report and started looking for the root causes to why this mistake happened in the first place. Was it because Captain Jacob van Santen was an instructor pilot that spent a lot of time in the simulator and was used to giving out his own ATC clearances? We'll never know, but what we do know is that these notes, together with the Spanish final report, did end up causing a lot of discussions about crew resource management and the importance of intra-cockpit discussions, but also how important it is to have very clear and unambiguous phraseology between air traffic control and pilots, so that these kind of mistakes and these kind of misunderstandings could never happen. For example, now we never use the word takeoff unless it is together with a takeoff clearance. We call it departure instead. Also from this investigation came rules about the need for very clear taxiway markings so that flight crew could easily find them even in low visibility procedures, and the importance of using ground radar whenever possible. Now, this accident was without a doubt one of the darkest moments in aviation history. But as an industry, we did what we always try to do. We take these hard-earned lessons and we try to use them to make the industry both better and safer for everyone involved. Now, if you like what I do here on the channel, then consider becoming part of my Patreon crew and maybe join up in my next weekly hangout. Or get yourself a t-shirt. Have an absolutely fantastic day, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.